Greetings, people. I wanted to add a little comment to another part of this recent monistic idealism interview with Bernardo Kastrup, which is in part one. I've sort of, while I'm doing other shit, I'm sort of with a half ear listening to various, philosophical videos. So just to have something, going on in the back of my mind. I like to do it that way, right? And I have realized, and this is maybe the second or third time I've listened through this, right? That there's so much confusion. I mean, as I've said recently, the more I listen to Bernardo Kastrup, the more confused I get about what he's actually trying to do. Because it seems he comes up with another description that sort of contradicts something I think he said maybe 3 months ago, or, in that way, right? So it feels like there's sort of a slippery slope where his philosophy tends to slide in one direction, and then all of a sudden it's in another direction. It's just weird, right? Now, this is just, a quick one, right? A quick one while it's away. The part of in part one, if I could, ooh, I'm a little, little caffeine. In part one of this interview, which is from 15th of January, it's about 5 weeks old, right? At 10:40, there's a question about the phenomenal concept strategy. Now, I've never heard about that, but there's something interesting here, and I'm going to comment on it as we go along, right? So it shouldn't be too long.
Well, in particular with the first part of your answer there. So there's what's called the phenomenal concept strategy, as you know. Sometimes they call it the phenomenal cope strategy. It's in which they hold that there's only an epistemic, but not an ontological gap between physics and subjective experience. So what would be your response?
So this is interesting, right? My recent video on my philosophy, my metaphilosophy, my ontology, metaphysics, and so on, right? Where I presented my simple idea of how things are connected in my philosophy. That, to me, ontology is a description of the whole toolbox, right? Now, if you think of a toolbox, like I have actually a rather big toolbox with pliers and hammers and screwdrivers and so on, right? All sorts of knives, Stanley knives, and whatever you have, right? All sorts of weird instruments. If you think of ontology as the toolbox you have to work with, right? Then epistemology is when you say, this particular tool I will qualify as knowledge. If you stay with the metaphor, right? It's not like all of my ontology is knowledge, because then I'm overlapping the idea of ontology and epistemology, that all that I have access to is also knowledge. Then I'm expanding both terms to cover everything, basically, that I have access to, and therefore conflating the terms. While I would say ontology is everything you have access to, and knowledge is a particular aspect of what I have access to, right? Why would you want two terms then, if they are the same? They're basically covering the same. And this is one of these examples where I feel that they are clouding, they are confusing what we are talking about. It's sort of you try to whack this mole, this sort of whack-a-mole game, right? Okay, now I think I've caught it down. This is what I mean by knowledge. No, I'll extend knowledge to be ontology. And okay, then what is mind then? Well, mind is everything. What the hell is that, right? It is more than ontology. It's also what is beyond ontology. But how do you get to that? Because I think so. It's like, oh man, right? Okay, a small rant.
To the phenomenal concept strategy.
When one is facing a inevitable conceptual contradiction within a system of thought, but one is emotionally committed to that system of thought, what one does is to...
This question here follows in the tail of a discussion of the so-called meta problem of consciousness. I don't like that terminology, but which is the appeal to a problem of consciousness, or the problem of consciousness, right? The heart problem, so-called, and that there's another problem, which is there's some people who don't even seem to realize that there is a problem. And that's the sort of so-called meta problem. I don't like the terminology, as I said, but this is what they call it, right? And what he is trying to clarify here, in my opinion, is that, okay, if you're wedded to a particular understanding, a particular metaphysics, then you try to wrap the whole of your physics around that understanding, even if it's incoherent or paradoxical or contradictory, whatever, right? In the case of physicalists, if they suffer from the meta problem, is that correct? Linguistic, I'm not sure. But they won't identify the actual hard problem. And when they try to fit the physics around it, it becomes more and more weird. And I basically agree with the connotations that Bernardo Kastrup deals with. It's the it's the epicycle problem, right? The old idea that the Earth is the center of the solar system, right? And you have to add more and more and more epicycles in order to make the planet movement, work. And it falls for the parsimonious. It's sort of, if it tends to be less and less and less and less and less parsimonious as you go along, that it might point that you're doing something, there's some foundational shit that doesn't work, right? So that's how I would say that you can use parsimony. And that's why I like when you do philosophy, a good beginning is half the work, right? If you map out the whole toolbox, the rest becomes so much easier. But if you don't map out the toolbox and you don't have a correct understanding of what is in the toolbox, it gets more and more complicated as you go down the road of epistemology and objectivity and science and ethics and so on. It just compounds and compounds and compounds and gets less and less parsimonious. That's where I would say parsimony comes in, right? Okay.
Start using convoluted conceptual indirections and strategies to cast doubt on the obviousness of that contradiction. And then things like illusionism, eliminativism, and appeals to the epistemic-ontic distinction arise. They are desperate torches, attempts to deny obvious contradictions in a certain system of thought, as opposed to backtracking and find the assumption that led us astray to begin with. And people do that when they are emotionally.
I agree with the method. I agree with the method that if it starts to get more and more weird, it's like there might be something wrong. I talked about the sort of the rabbit hole that you constantly fall deeper and deeper. While if you don't think there is a rabbit hole, you're trying to create the landscape above the hole, and you think there is no rabbit hole, right? But you have to realize if there is a problem, and the evidence, it's not evidence, but what other term would you use? The feeling of there's something might be wrong is if you have to go into sort of conceptual loops and abstractions upon abstractions and so on. There's some fundamental problem probably, and you have to wind back to find where it goes wrong. And I would say it's a good idea when you philosophize, go back to find your reduction base, right? And find out how you find it. And you can't cherry pick it just like Bernardo Kastrup says you can do. You have to work it. You have to argue. You have to create a metaphilosophy that says, I'm going to approach it this way, right? Because it makes sense because of this, that, and the other, right? At least attempt to do so, right? Only attempt to go. Don't go so far as, thinking allows.
Committed and even socially committed to a certain perspective that has happened throughout history. Our time is no exception to that. Look, ultimately, it is a fact that ultimately all we have to construct an ontology is our epistemology.
Now that's interesting, right? We can only construct an ontology I want to hear it again to get really precise on this, right? Now, this is where he goes into the deep end, in my opinion, right?
To construct an ontology is our epistemology. Ultimately, it is a fact that ultimately all we have.
Ultimately, what does that mean? Is that at the far end or the near beginning end, right? Ultimately, that's more like at the far end of reasoning. That's the wrong direction. He should say foundationally, right? I might have made the same mistake at some point, but in this particular case, it's very important. Now he says fact.
To construct an ontology, it is a fact that...
It is a fact. How do you get to a fact before you have ontology and epistemology? Can you have facts before you have an ontology and epistemology? That's interesting, right? Because I would like to know the definition of that fact, right? Please give it to me, man, right?
Ultimately, all we have to construct an ontology...
That's the we, all that we have. He appeals to having solved the problem of other minds. He is appealing to other minds. It's his mind and all the other minds. We, right? How could you else understand we? In the sense of mind, there's some other, phenomena out there encompassed in something I would call mind.
Is our epistemology. It's all we have to construct an ontology. Is our epistemology.
Okay, so he says you can only construct an ontology from your epistemology. So epistemology must be foundational to ontology. How do you do that? Because ontology is describing that toolbox from which you are pinpointing what you mean by knowledge. How could it be the other way around? How can you know something before you describe that which is to be known? How do you do this, man? Now, it's like he's just talking for the 10 minutes, 11 minutes, and all of a sudden, this thing arrives, right? It's like everything is turned upside down. Everything is turned upside down. He says ultimately, where he means foundationally. He talks about a fact that can be encompassing description of both ontology and epistemology at the same time. And he says ontology has to arrive from epistemology. Epistemology is a kind of philosophy. Ontology is also a kind of philosophy, right? So it's not a category error, but it's a what comes from what, right? You can't have the roof of the house before you have the walls and the foundation. You can start to make the roof, but then it won't be a roof, right? You have to have the other shit. There's a structure to it. And it's, to the best of my understanding, this is the first time he mentions so clearly or somewhat clearly what he talks about when he means epistemology. He's basically saying, what I'm hearing is, all my phenomena are my epistemology. So he's basically conflating phenomena with epistemology. But that's a category because phenomena is what you're describing. Epistemology is the philosophy you're using in order to find what you mean by knowledge, which he apparently says is all phenomena. It sounds like it at least, right? How does he do this? I have no clue how he does this, because there seems to be no philosophy from which he bases these conclusions.
We have. And this is acknowledged as a limitation of human beings. We do not have direct access to reality as it is.
So ontology is a description of reality, apparently. So ontology is larger than his epistemology, which is apparently his phenomena. So you need those, you have to work with those phenomena, which he calls epistemology, which must mean he means it's knowledge, right? From that, he has to some kind of abstraction towards something bigger, which he calls ontology, that encompasses all that he can imagine, right? violating the idea of imagination, because an imagination must be a part of his epistemology then, right? These terms are being, this is just too much, mate. You have to clarify how you do all this. And how you all of a sudden get to weave the idea of epistemology into this.
Cooped up in our models of reality, in our theory making.
We are cooked up in our models and our theory making. But that's not... a theory is a particular abstraction or idea you have in that which you call mind, which is apparently epistemology now, right? So it's a model based on some other part of your experience, which is maybe objects that moves about, right? The beaver that falls from the Eiffel Tower. Then you have the Eiffel Tower, you have the beaver, and you have Earth, which is where the beaver possibly ends its journey, right? So I have a model that says when you drop beavers from Eiffel Towers, they tend to move to Earth, right? Fair enough, but that's an abstraction, right? That's just within the confinement of what you now call epistemology. I would say it's stupid to call it epistemology, because then everything is epistemology. Then if I have a stomachache, it's epistemology. It just violates the idea of the use of the terms, in my opinion. It's really, really, really crappy, this, right? This is where this is an example where Bernardo Kastrup gets my piss boiling, right? Where he just thrown around these terms that it's enormous terms without any genuine clarification of what the hell he's talking about, right? I really don't like it.
Making our hypothesis, our conceptual armor, and so forth. So yes, there is a
conceptual armor, right? That's also sort of a poetic way of putting it, right? Conceptual armor. It's like we are fighting a battle against other concepts of
distinction there, and there is a gap, and that gap can be appealed to if one is determined to avoid the natural conclusions of reasoning and evidence.
But what evidence could you have for something that is beyond evidence? How can you do that? Evidence is when you experience something. What kind of evidence could it be? Otherwise, you are using your interpretations and your imaginations as a kind of evidence. And that's why you think you can extend it to something beyond your so-called epistemology. Then you jump into these cloud castle and say, okay, now I'm in a cloud castle mode. Now I can come up with shit, right? But then it's not evidence. An interpretation is not evidence. If you experience elephant, you might interpret it as an evidence that you're close to Africa, right? But the elephant is not Africa. The evidence is your interpretation of the actual object and its placement in whatever, right? The evidence is not a fact. The elephant is a fact. You interpret as evidence for Africa, potentially, right? As an example. This is the leap into abstraction he doesn't understand that he's doing. And he jumps into these abstractions very quickly in order to get into, big mind daddy area of ripples and excitations and all that, right?
To something that doesn't hold any water, you can always appeal to that and say, well, your argument is excellent, but it's epistemic, and ontology may be different from our knowledge of the world, different from our epistemology.
No, what world? But now he's talk about a world. Before it was nature. So what is nature and world and ontology and epistemology? And now this is all conflated into, what are you talking about, mate? Maybe you should make some kind of diagram that explains whether or not these particular bubbles of content have overlappings, or they are dichotomies or trichotomies or whatever, and how they interact with each other and so on, because it's completely lost in words now. You're obfuscating, you're creating this sort of, you're putting out a smoke flare in order to confuse people. So they say, I'm rather confused. But he says some very fine word like, conceptual armor. It sounds very smart, right? So he must be right. And by the way, I'm a Christian.
That's always the case.
I'm a Christian, so I want some.
So you can always appeal to this, but that's not the game. The
Shut
game
up.
is having acknowledged.
I need somebody to combine woo-woo shit with philosophy and science. I need him so badly, so I don't have to tell mommy she was crazy, right? And she took advantage of me and filled me with bullshit, right?
The limitations of epistemology, the limitations of what we can know.
The limitations of knowledge, epistemology, is not the same as the limitations of what we can know, because epistemology is the thinking you use in order to get to the limits of what you can know. So how can you say this? So you're conflating epistemology with knowledge. No, epistemology is the thinking behind what you classify or define as knowledge, and thereby implying some limitations to it. For instance, empiricism, right?
The game is to come up with the most plausible, the most viable model of nature.
Okay, so it's a model, so it's science. You're appealing to science in an area where you cannot do science. Science is confined to the dashboard of yours, right? Another one of these stories you're telling about, metaphors. In order to do science, you have to have empiricism, right? Otherwise, what the hell's the matter with you, right? But empiricism is through your dashboard. Those are the concepts, the cognitions, and how they move about. You've said that to yourself. Then you can make a model of something that is beyond modeling. How do you do that? You have to abstract yourself into an abstraction castle somewhere and sit there and come up with ideas of fields of excitation and ripples and so on, right? That then explain that which you are using in order to get to these castles. It's stupid, man. It's fucking ridiculous.
Of ontology, model of reality as it is in itself. And sometimes they have good
So now
reason.
It's called reality. It's nature and world and reality. So now it's conflating three different words, right? Are they the same? Are you just riffing? Are you just sitting there feeling good about yourself because you can throw around these fancy terms? Duh.
To rule out some hypotheses. But if some people do not want to rule out those hypotheses, then they will always point to that gap between our knowledge of nature and nature as it is in itself.
How do you... If you can't get to what it is in itself, you can only make a model of it. How can you compare it and say there's discrepancy if you don't have access to one of them? It's like saying that apple over there is different to another apple that isn't there, and I can't get to it. What? How do you do all this, right? And that's what I'm appealing to whenever you have to criticize somebody's philosophy. Go to the foundations, go to the starting point. How do they get off, right? How do get off? How does the rocket start, right? What's the fuel? What's the beginning point? How do they do this, right? When you look at Bernardo Kastrup, this is the starting point of his. It's completely confused, right? It's completely messed up.
To say, well, but there is still a possibility that I am right. Well, there is, but you see, there is a possibility that there is a flying spaghetti monster moving the planets around their orbits.
Okay, so now he's using sort of a straw manning of the spaghetti monster as some kind of theory about how the planets moves about, right? Because he doesn't like that, because it's a criticism of the stupid idea of a god, right? There's as much evidence for the spaghetti monster as there is for God. Mommy just didn't force feed you the spaghetti monster. She force fed you God instead, right? So I think this is not, but have a listen to yourself, right? How fucked up can you be in your foundations of, I mean, I know this is sort of a polemic kind of, it's a YouTube video and so on. It's not this finely cut, piece of written philosophy. I understand that. But the more you have to be careful about how you present things, because this is fucked up, right? You can't do it. This is dysfunctional. This is a pile of words, right? And because very few people, I suppose, feel confident or feel that they can sort of handle these deeper ends of things, are more likely to say, well, I guess he's right because I'm too stupid, right? So you can get away with it. The more foundational it is, the more stupid it seems to be, the things that people are willing to eat, right? This is garbage, right? This is a, dumpster fire of linguistic rather than philosophy, right? Okay. Have a nice day. See you in the next one.